Hello, I'm Scott Jaschik, editor of Inside Higher Ed. Welcome to today's webcast on Paying for College Today, Debt and Financial Planning. Joining me today is my fellow editor, Doug Lederman. We'll be walking you through a PowerPoint, and we'll have lots of time to talk about your questions and comments. But first, some housekeeping. We very much want your questions, and we'll turn to them in the second half of this presentation. But you can ask a question at any time. Just write it in the bubble at the bottom of the Q&A box on your screen. Sometimes it helps to know what kind of institution you're at, so please feel free to list your institution or its type or your job title in the question. Doug and I will be reading the questions when we answer them, and you'll only see questions you have asked. If you want to tweet about today's program, which we welcome, our hashtag for the event is IHEDebt. We are recording today's event and also transcribing it for those with hearing disabilities. And before we start, I want to thank Regent for its support of this webcast. So now we're ready to begin. There's the contact information for Doug and myself. Please feel free to reach out anytime about anything in higher education, and we'll see what we can do to help you. First, I want to note that we have the coronavirus, as you all know. And it affects everything in higher education, including some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. Colleges' financial aid strategies have definitely been affected by COVID. But I think it's important to note that the COVID didn't create the problems we're talking about or the underlying issues we're talking about. Most of the issues in higher ed, predated COVID and will outlive COVID. And it's important to, that just in the current frame of reference, when, everything seems COVID related, to just remind yourselves that these issues of debt and college financing really are not unique to this era, but they're affected by the era in a number of ways. The second reason I wanted to begin with a slide on COVID is just to thank all of you. I realize that right now, you are doing lots more than you did before. You're quite likely doing it in a different location than you did it before. You may have family responsibilities that are taking up your time as well. Thank you. At Inside Higher Ed, it's our job to pester you for answers to questions and just to know what's going on. And I really appreciate more than I can say, the professionalism that you've shown and the expertise you've shown on these issues. So now let's start with what are tuition rates now? And here, I want to note a few things. First of all, the numbers that you see there are the sticker price of tuition. That's not what people actually pay, or what most people actually pay. And it's very important to remember that. The aid comes into play, federal and institutional aid and state aid, and loans come into play in a very meaningful way. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing to remember is that looking at these numbers, you would think that, community colleges, wow, they have it easy. They have very low numbers. And public 4 years have very low numbers. The fact is, for people looking to go to college, all of these numbers are high. And that's something I'm going to say a few times because it's hard for people who read about the most expensive sticker price colleges and universities to really realize that all of higher ed seems very high to most people. Most people have no idea what college costs. And then when they start to read up on it, they're likely to read lots of articles about the most expensive colleges. And in addition, some of the most expensive colleges are also some of the most generous on financial aid. So the tuition rates are very important to higher ed, but they really only tell part of the picture. How are tuition rates changing now? Public four-year colleges had the lowest percentage increase in 30 years. And private colleges also had the lowest increase in 30 years. Now, prior to this year, and the COVID, COVID is an issue which affected many people. These colleges were generally increasing their tuition by more than the lowest level, weren't getting the lowest level increase in 30 years. Many publics, especially, were having large increases. The average sticker price for community colleges froze in 14 states and many districts this year. That is an important sign in terms of what people want and expect. The other thing that's interesting is that the community colleges that froze tuition aren't necessarily getting more students. Many community colleges are down 20% in enrollment. So the tuition rates only tell part of the picture. Doug, did you want to add here?
Yeah, I do, and I want to echo Scott's thanks to you all for being here and his appreciation for all the good and important work you're doing. So I just wanted to add a little bit of context around sort of the tuition rates, and there has been a real Scott and I have both been doing this for a long time, and there's been complaints about the cost of college and the price of college for forever, as long as we've been doing it, 30 plus years. But there's no question that we are seeing increasing scrutiny, in part to the price, but also increasing questioning of the value of higher education. And value is kind of a tricky concept to describe and to define, because people don't necessarily mean it the same way. But I tend to think about value as sort of an equation of price divided by or minus what you think you get for it. And again, that's where the price has been going up, and that's been sort of, I think, leading to increased questioning about whether what people get, whether it's a good job or a advancement in a job or some learning that they value in some other way, has been worth it. And so we have seen, and there's been lots of sort of evidence that over the last couple of decades, the price of higher education, particularly the net price, what people pay, has been rising faster than many other things. And what we saw this year, and we've seen some slowing in the rate of increase over the last few years. And then the reason I think we saw the lowest increase this fall in a long time was because of sort of recognition that potential students were in a difficult position, more difficult. A lot of, the unemployment rate was as high as it's been for pretty much forever. And so it was sort of a recognition. And again, colleges set tuition taking into account a lot of factors, including sort of public institutions take into account state funding and other sources of revenue. And basically we saw they take into account the recognition of, to some extent, the recognition of what they think people are going to be willing to pay. And this year we certainly saw, I think, recognition that this was not a good time to raise tuition. And we even saw some places lower it in recognition that they were going to be mostly online, and that that it wasn't necessarily going to be the full experience. So anyway, the tuition, and Scott made a really important point about sort of the difference between the sticker price and net tuition, which we'll probably return to later on.
Thank you. So then I want to stress, this is the but. The rate of tuition increases and the cost of tuition was already a burden for many families. And this is pre-COVID and with COVID. Many families do not feel that they can afford higher education at the prices that are charged. And the major concern is debt. Borrowing is imagined to be far worse than it sometimes is, or far better than it sometimes is. And debt is a huge concern that is keeping many students from a higher education. Undergraduate borrowing, here's some statistics. Students and parents borrowed a total of $102 billion last year, compared to $134.1 billion in 2010-11. The 2019-20 academic year was the 9th straight with a decline in borrowing. So there, you know, in those first two bullets, you get some statistics that might make you think, oh, okay, this is great. We're finally tackling the problem. But total debt per borrower is going up, and the numbers remain huge. And this is something I think is very important for people at colleges to realize, that even though they might have some numbers that they're cheered by the way they're going, and of course I'm encouraged too that the numbers are going, that some of the numbers are going down. But as long as more students feel that they have to borrow more money to go to college, it sort of doesn't matter, because they are they are accumulating debt, and they fear the accumulation of debt will hurt them. And I want to talk about fear of borrowing for a minute, because fear of borrowing results in colleges losing students and losing potential students. And how does this play out? It may play out with a student getting a good financial aid package for freshman year that doesn't carry on. And then the student has to figure out what to do. If he or she has to borrow more than they feel comfortable borrowing. It also plays out when students are first going to college. When a student is told, well, to come here, you'd have to borrow this, and this is how you could do it, many students are scared off. And this is despite the fact that most colleges have generous financial aid policies and are trying their best to help students. And this is just really important for colleges to remember. You may feel that you are giving everything you possibly can to students, but at core, in some ways, it doesn't matter, because the students have to, really buckle down to make that decision to borrow. I'll date myself here. I borrowed $10,000 in college, which was a long time ago, and it seemed an enormous sum. But I paid it back. It didn't ruin my life. I would consider it a good investment that I made. But to many, it doesn't feel that way. Doug?
Yeah, I would just want to add a few sort of notes of color to what Scott was just talking about. One is that there is the fear of borrowing is different depending on certain characteristics. We know that there are certain demographic groups that are particularly averse to borrowing. Latino Americans, Latin Americans are particularly sort of in that category. There's just a sort of a culture that discourages that. We could dig more deeply in. Maybe we will in the Q&A if people want to go there about more deeply into some of the characteristics and the sort of details about the borrowing data that were on the previous slide. But the worst debt in general, there are obviously there are stories, pretty regularly in the New York Times and other publications about the New York University barista who NYU graduate who's working as a barista in Washington Square, and with $120,000 in debt. And those borrowers they exist, and some of them really struggle, but the people who struggle the most with debt, and in some ways, and this is part of the problem, is the people who struggle the most with debt in general are the people who didn't come out with a credential, who sort of spent time in an academic program and didn't achieve. And again, there are lots of reasons. I probably shouldn't have said didn't achieve, because that makes it sound like they fell short in some way, but who, for one reason or another, did not complete a credential, and therefore often ended up sort of not getting what they came for, and presumably were not able to parlay the money they spent and the debt they accrued into something that is valuable in their lives and in the job market. And that is part of going back to what we were talking about earlier about the sort of the questions about value. at a time when roughly fewer than 3 in 5 people who start an undergraduate program earn a degree within 6 years. That means that education debt, which averages around 30-some thousand, low 30s $1,000, remains a very good bet for a lot of people. But there are a good number of people for whom it doesn't pay off, and some of what's happened in the last few years is that these cumulative numbers, the fact that total education debt is well over $1.5 trillion. It wasn't that long ago that we passed the $1 trillion mark, and that was just sort of mind-blowing for a lot of people. And I think it had a real significant impact on the conversation around higher education. But there's a very nuanced, I guess, the one important point is there's a very nuanced conversation, and different groups are affected differently. Different borrowers are in different categories, and really a lot of it comes down to what you were able to parlay that debt and that spending into, and whether it turned out to be something that was usable and valuable.
So how to avoid these problems? The first bullet is preferable, obviously, is that to be a college that is phenomenally wealthy. A few colleges have announced that their students don't have to borrow. And well, that's great, but try not to focus on them. I would say that what they're doing is great for the students who are there, but really irrelevant for most students. Most students will have to borrow to get a good college education. But there are different ways to borrow and different approaches to borrowing by institutions. Being creative, smart, and resourceful is the way that most colleges will manage this issue. And I just throw it out, a little bit in a joke, because I think that that people hear about, if only I could be Harvard and have their aid policy. Well, it would be nice, but most aren't, and there are ways to manage if you're not. First of all, I want to talk about loan forgiveness. Now, this is a very hot issue right now. A lot of people are calling on President-elect Biden to forgive either all student borrowing or some student borrowing. I don't know if he's going to do so, but it's certainly getting a lot of attention. But there's some real questions about loan forgiveness. One, is it fair? If you did not go to college, you don't gain from loan forgiveness for college. The loan forgiveness is obviously for student loans. Is it necessarily fair that to count a college loan as more important than a mortgage loan or a car loan or something else? There are a lot of issues about student loans that may seem very clear to those of us involved in higher education that are less clear to those in the rest of the world who just have to look at it. Is it effective? There's been some interesting research published recently that suggests that loan forgiveness might be more helpful to white and Asian families than to Black and Latinx families. Is that fair? Is it fair? You have to answer. You have to consider these questions when talking about loan forgiveness. And then there's the question: is it actually going to happen? And here I have no magic crystal ball into the future, but I'm going to be a little bit of a negative. I'm going to take the negative on this. It may happen in a small way. I suspect it may not happen. The House Republicans may control the Senate, and if they don't control the Senate, it will be a tie where they will continue to have a lot of influence. And they don't like this idea. So I think that it's interesting how far it's come, how broad the demands are for loan forgiveness, but personally, I am somewhat doubtful that it will happen. Doug, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I probably, just like you, kind of always wary of making too many predictions. I guess I'd probably focus on the first couple of bullets, which I actually think are sort of influence the third, which is that I totally understand the push for it, and I understand that there are a lot of people who feel that the money what they borrowed, and especially in eras where the economy is terrible and people are having trouble getting jobs, I'm sort of probably much more supportive of the kinds of temporary sort of delays in repayment that we've been seeing. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess where I was going is that I tend to listen to the people who are really experts on financial aid, who very much have student interests at heart, but are thinking about sort of the whole. And in general, going back to the sort of fair and effective bullets, there is a real sense that sort of loan forgiveness broadly, and obviously there are ways I know there are ways to tailor it that make it less regressive and more fair, but in general, it's not targeted. To me, in my humble view, it's not targeted in the best possible way. It helps some people who probably don't need it, and it doesn't necessarily solve the problems of some of the people who are struggling the most with being able to afford college. And so I think, and again, I would, just like there's been a lot of talk about listening to the scientists now, I would listen to the financial aid researchers and the people who are really experts on sort of affordability and financial aid equity. And again, they're probably much more likely to, because remember, there are limited dollars, and what Scott was just talking about, the limits on what certain Republicans are going to want to do, and there are absolutely going to be, even in this era where we're sort of printing money and spending lots on COVID and other things, there are going to be limits on what is available to fund higher education affordability. And I think that, proposals to increase the Pell Grant and do other things that increase affordability in general for those who need it most are likely going to be seen as a priority. And I tend to think that those are going to be better policies for the whole, for everyone, even if it disproportionately helps those who are lower on the socioeconomic scale. So that's just my 2 cents.
Now I want to talk about Tidewater Community College, and I want to talk about it as an example of what colleges can do. And now Tidewater does not have a massive endowment, doesn't have much of an endowment at all, and yet it has made a difference in the debt that students borrow. And they also have, an approach that borrowing is fine, but it's how much you borrow. So what does Tidewater do? They counsel students, and they make them come and get counseling before Tidewater will certify that they are a student entitled to borrow. Now, a college cannot prevent most students from borrowing money, but it can impose this sort of rule that gets the students to come in. Now, what does Tidewater do with them when they're there? They ask them what they plan to do when they graduate and where they plan to live. And that is the single question that is most important for students. And what they found is that most students have some idea where they want to live. They don't want to live at home, say, or with their parents, but they haven't really thought about it. And, and by thinking about it, I mean a budget. Tidewater makes them do a budget, where they have to sit down, come up with how much, what do they want to spend, and also what it will cost, and how much they will earn in whatever their chosen field is. Now, in doing this, Tidewater doesn't use average incomes overall. It uses average incomes for that specific career and for that specific location. And what they found is that many students were frankly clueless on what it would cost to live in a certain area. Now, how does this change what students do? Many students borrow, but borrow less. And that is a very good thing for them if, in fact, they also worked out a budget for the current year and they can afford it. And many students, can borrow less. And other students change the programs that they borrow for. They found more students using parents borrowing more plus loans for more students. The exact changes aren't so important as the fact of looking at the individual situation and then making the decision. And this is the kind of direct aid counseling that so many colleges need to do. Only some are doing, and yet this changes students' lives for the better, not just now, but when they graduate. Now, what are the keys to making that change happen? One is to have a good system for delivering and tracking student aid and loans. So many colleges' systems are not good. They've got old systems. They have students forced to wait in lines. There's a lot that can be done to make a good system. A good system for students, and I want to stress for students, and is a good system for institutions. Because really your interests are allied if you will have students who are happy that they're getting aid and loans, but also they can get them in a simplified way. Direct communication with students on their options is so important. Ideas about how to shake students up, like I mentioned at Tidewater, knowing what the patterns are at your institution enables you to come up with things that will surprise students and then help them make different choices. And finally, realism about borrowing. A lot of I see a columnist, for instance, who writes regularly about how that columnist's children will not borrow for college. And, that's great if they can afford it, but many can't. And borrowing itself shouldn't be the enemy. It's borrowing too much, borrowing without understanding the terms involved. That's the real enemy. And I don't think enough colleges are making that point. Doug, did you want to add there?
Yeah, I guess I sort of might sort of sum up not everything on this slide, but a lot of the problems that we have here. And again, I don't want to. Before I say that, I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that there aren't real issues with whether colleges are charging too much or charging the right amount, or whether they should be finding ways to lower their own costs so that they can lower their prices, et cetera, et cetera. That's not that's probably a topic for another day. Although again, if people want to talk about it in the Q&A, we can. But what I guess the a good part of the answer that sort of you add up several of the things on this slide and several of the things we've talked about is better financial education. And we do a pretty crappy job, that's the technical term, in this country of financial awareness and especially for young people. And the Tidewater example that Scott laid out, there are others that we've written about, but institutions sort of have to be creating better. And it can't be all on colleges themselves, but it probably ought to start earlier, and parents have a responsibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do believe that there is a real incentive for colleges to have better approaches to financial awareness broadly. It's better for their students generally, and it's certainly better for them if they have students who are, it's certainly, given that we are increasingly in an era where colleges are going to be held accountable for the debt that their students have, and we didn't talk about that particularly in this slide about sort of the accountability approaches, but colleges have always been held somewhat accountable through default rates and the like for their the sort of debt and affordability of their educations, but we are going to see more and more of that, and if colleges are going to be held accountable for that, it's very much in their interest to do a better job in making their students financially savvy and aware. So
that is a very nice segue into the last slide on financial planning. And the problem with financial planning, it sort of relates to what Doug said about financial knowledge, that most Americans are lousy at it, and they don't do it well. And if they continue to not do it well, they can't expect to have the benefits that this program offers with good borrowing, good aid to go to college. Now, when I say this, I don't want you to, as people at colleges, to just write off the parents. There are some parents who are good financial planners. There's some students who are good financial planners. But it's important in your framing of the issue to the parents and to the students to recognize that financial planning isn't something they have probably been doing well, and isn't something that they necessarily know how to do, and that is very important. That sums up our overview. I want to again thank Regent Education for supporting this webcast. And now we're going to turn to your questions. Doug, do you have a first question in mind?
Yeah, there's some good ones, and I encourage you to keep adding to them because we've got some good ones, but we'll have a good chunk of time left to talk about them. So a couple of questions that are sort of related, and I'll read, I don't know if I'll read them both fully, but basically the gist of it is, well, let me read one first. Since so many more people look for, quote, return on investment when evaluating the cost of college, do you think that colleges will have to gravitate to more specific job training, certificate earning curriculums in order to meet the needs of the economy of the future? That might make it easier to borrow if the path to future career was more clear. And then again, the other person says, to what degree should schools tailor the academic programs they offer to ones that are lucrative, i.e. de-emphasize humanities, education, human services degrees so that students are more able to pay off debt? So those are good questions, pretty related, suggesting essentially that if it's true what sort of I was saying before, that more people are sort of judging higher education's whether a higher education is good or bad by sort of the job prospects and where it leads, which I think is true. I think it's always been true, but certainly right now, if you ask surveys of students and parents, job, career advancement, career success remains the primary reason that people go to college. I would hate it and I don't think it's necessary for to go down the road that these people are talking about. Listen, I think it is absolutely true. We are moving toward much better clarity. One of the sort of interesting things happening, and it's not really visible right now, but we have gotten much better data in recent years about how people fare as they go through college and as they leave. There's been a lot of work on data systems within individual states, and we're now moving toward sort of a federal data product that allows for this. And we're seeing publication of the salary outcomes for individual academic programs. And as those data become better and become much more commonly used and shared and discussed, I think it's natural to go down the road that these people are talking about. And there's no question that there are programs where graduates earn more than others. But I think it's possible to get to what one of the questioners talked about, sort of as the path to future career becoming clearer. That is absolutely smart, and that is someplace that we are heading and should be heading. It should be much. People should have a much clearer sense as you're starting down an academic road about where it's going to lead, what the likely outcomes are, what the potential uses of that academic programs, are in the job market, what people who get that degree at that particular college tend to go on to do. That is all to the good, and whether that's through alumni surveys or actual, big data uses and analysis, we're going to get pretty quickly to much better awareness of that. And that is 100% to the good. What I hopefully shouldn't do, because the data don't really support it, is to say, therefore, we don't need any more English majors or any more anthropology majors or any more sociology majors like I was. Even though there are fields that help people more than others, or that where the graduates tend to come out with higher salaries, not everybody's going to be a petroleum engineer or some of the other fields. And honestly, I'm very much somebody who believes that while money and career pay is important, so is career satisfaction, and that people are much better off in an academic, in a job and in a career and in a life of work that they're happy with. So I don't, and there are data that show that people with English majors can do quite well and over a period of time. So I would regret if we came to the feeling that the only value of a degree is what happens to you in the career, in your career. But I think it's fair to say that that's important to a lot of people, and that people should have much greater awareness. I don't think it necessarily follows that colleges should only be offering certain STEM degrees or computer science or other things that tend to pay more.
When speaking about loan forgiveness and the huge amounts of student loan debt that students have, why is there not more of an emphasis on financial education? Students need to learn financial planning skills to understand their obligations and to plan for repayment once they graduate. I agree, but I think you need to consider the fact that whether a student who has no skills in financial planning, it's probably only in part the student's fault. Students were not taught these skills in high school, in college, in grade school. They were never taught it, or most students have never been taught to plan financially. And so the question really for colleges is how to encourage this teaching, but you need the student to make a first decision to enroll, to accept the offer of admission. And that's very tricky. Many students do not understand, for instance, when they are borrowing what a private loan is compared to a non-private loan, and they are borrowing money with terms and conditions that may be spelled out somewhere, but that they've never read. And so you need to encourage students to read more, to plan more. But I sympathize with with your point, but I just worry that the students don't have the skills themselves to do it because they've never been taught them. Doug?
Yes. Again, some good questions. One would imagine, this is one would imagine that if the Pell Grant were to double, as is being discussed, student debt should go down for undergraduate students. However, there is the concept of the Bennett hypothesis, which suggests that the increased federal aid will result in similarly sized increases in tuition and fees. So there is a lot of there are studies, and there's a dispute about the link between increases in federal financial aid and college tuition. There are research who say that it doesn't prove out. I'm somebody, and college leaders very much don't favor the hypothesis. I have to admit that to me, I believe that I don't think it's dollar for dollar, but I actually do believe that colleges have taken advantage, have benefited from, been given more flexibility to raise their tuition when there is generous money flowing from government sources. And again, there are researchers who would probably scream at me for saying that, but I think it makes sort of common sense. And I do believe that whether it's true or not, whether there's an actual link or whether I believe that college tuition and college prices collectively have risen faster than many Americans' willingness to pay. And again, that whether you believe in the Bennett hypothesis or not, I think we are starting to see real countervailing sort of downward pressure on college tuitions, and I think that's going to put a lot of colleges in a difficult spot. And I think that's hard, and I think I worry about what the impact of that is going to be on institutions and on on college employees. Certainly right now, we're seeing a lot of cost-cutting efforts on a lot of college campuses resulting from decreased revenue from, in some extent, from tuition, although a lot more from room and board and other things that colleges sort of struggled with COVID, with fewer students enrolled in person. So, and we're seeing all sorts of impacts on that. Academic programs eliminated and faculty members, including tenured faculty members, losing their jobs, and certainly lots of pay freezes and all sorts of things. And there's going to be pain if colleges are to sort of reset their tuitions or limit their tuition increases even more than they have, et cetera. So, but I do believe that increasing the Pell Grant and doing increasing sort of making college more affordable for students with sort of, which I think has historically been the federal government's primary role in higher education, is a good thing. I do believe that it is unlikely for there to be more money flowing into higher education without also more accountability and attempts to try to, and the federal government has never been good at trying to limit tuition prices. That's not really a role that that I think the government should play. But I do think that better understanding of how colleges are spending their money, and I just think there is going to be more consumer and other pressure that puts downward pressure. So I think my hope is that the Bennett hypothesis will not, I don't think that the Bennett hypothesis will be allowed to continue to be carried out, because other forces, I think, are going to limit colleges from increasing their tuition as much as has recently been the case historically.
Agree or disagree? Our current financing model is sustainable. Well, that's quite a question. I would say it really depends. I will not reveal the institution that the questioner is from, but it's at a flagship university in a state that probably could give more money to that flagship university. So, in terms of where it is unsustainable right now, and right now we are in a really, constrained period of time because of COVID. The next legislative sessions are going to be a disaster for higher ed, Democratic state or Republican state. They just don't have money, and Biden will give them some more money, but not enough. No one could give them enough money. And so we're going to be seeing many states that are going to make deep cuts primarily to the, across higher ed, but where it's going to be felt the most is the regional publics, not the flagships, and the community colleges. Those are institutions that cannot admit more out-of-state students or raise $1 billion in a private fundraising campaign. On the private side, please don't think that private colleges are all fine, because they are definitely not. Generally, small, poor, and by poor I don't mean the quality of students, but I mean the money. Small colleges without much money are facing serious problems. Now, American higher education has been through other periods where it certainly seemed quite difficult, but I would say we are going to see real change in the next year. Now, what about the colleges that will last, that will survive, like flagship state universities? They'll survive. My fear is the way they'll survive is becoming more private. They will let in more out-of-state students. They will, fundraise. They will hope that athletics works, although it may have the opposite effect. They will do things to get attention. And they will also rely heavily on the federal government to supply research money. All of these things will work, but they won't necessarily make the institutions truly tied to their states in the way that they have been historically. Doug?
A couple other questions. One I want to think about a little more before I get to it, but this is a kind of a pulling back the frame and looking pretty philosophically. Is higher education a private benefit or a public good? This is fundamental to developing an equitable funding model. And then the person adds a PS. I think it's the latter, meaning a public good. I very much believe that higher education is good for society, and the public good argument tends to point to be grounded on the idea that having more people get education after high school is good for everybody, and that it lowers, having a more educated population tends to lower health care costs and improve voting rates and do all sorts of things that are good for society, that colleges and universities and the sort of higher education ecosystem produces knowledge that drives innovation and businesses and all sorts of things, and that colleges are employers. And so there are all sorts of things. And so I very much do believe that higher education is a public good. Having said that, colleges have contributed to the idea that higher education is also good for an individual, and that and colleges have contributed with some of their own rhetoric, partly in response to demands for proof and for evidence before state legislatures that higher education deserves funding, by saying our graduates earn X and they provide all this tax revenue back to the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so colleges have sort of kind of unwittingly, or at least at some risk, embrace the private benefit argument. The result is that that colleges and universities and higher education has been sort of hung on its own petard a little bit for having embraced the private good argument so much that some people favor it and see it primarily as that. And I think the turning back of that is difficult. I think colleges and college university leaders should make the case for the various ways that colleges contribute to their communities and to the country, and continue to make the public good argument. And I believe it's valid, but I also think it's, I wouldn't say that the argument is lost, but I think it's, at the very least, people believe, and I think probably reasonably so, that it's both. And the person's right that depending on which way you view it, or which one of those views is in most in favor would influence what kind of system you would ultimately put in place for affordability. I do believe that the federal government's historic and the historic view that sort of most of the financial aid and most of the support should be based on some financial need. I still favor that, and I think that sort of supports the public benefit argument, public good argument, because it sort of makes the government's role in trying to get sort of level the playing field, because it's an important good for everyone. Anyway, I'm not going to answer that question in this webcast, but I think it's an important issue, and I think it's one worth thinking about.
45% of student loans are now not being paid back. This creates credit issues, and forgiveness of loans creates a taxable event. You should discuss that. So I will. The problem with people who are not paying back their student loans, leaving aside the question of forgiving them, is huge. There are, I don't have the numbers handy, but there are senior citizens repaying student loans. The idea of student loans, or the original idea, was that it would be something that people would repay as they were starting their careers at the beginning. And then they would move on and borrow for a house or another event if they needed to borrow. And many people who borrow student loans, whether they repay it or not, find themselves unable to totally pay back, and then to live the life they want, to live a life where they are thriving in society. This is terrible. Now, part of the problem here is that some students, some emphasis, are borrowing too much, and that is big. And that goes to, are they getting counseling on how much they truly need to borrow to do more? And I think with good counseling, they would many would borrow less. Doug?
Yeah. So I only have time for we only have time for one or two more questions. I was going to take a different one, but I'm going to take one that just came in that I think is really interesting and an important. Why are colleges so much less affordable in the U.S. than in Canada or UK for their college-age citizens or eligible legal residents? There are excellent and prestigious institutions in these countries as well. So a couple things. First of all, I think it's important to keep in mind how much bigger and broader the American higher education ecosystem is than the systems in either of those countries. And there are many very affordable colleges and universities in the U.S., particularly public ones, but especially if you're talking about sort of net price, plenty of private ones that make higher education very affordable. But the real answer to that question is that is government subsidy. In general, colleges and universities in both of the countries that the questioner mentioned, Canada and Britain, are pretty heavily government subsidized, more so than is true in the U.S. Now, there's plenty of government subsidy for American colleges and universities, public ones, and to a lesser extent private ones in terms of student aid and some other funds that flow to those institutions. We're seeing, particularly in Britain right now, we're seeing Britain move toward the sort of in the direction that the U.S. has been, and we're seeing, making higher education affordable is very difficult, and governments, especially when you get to the numbers that the U.S. has had a greater proportion of its citizens in higher education. They got sort of bought into that idea earlier than a lot of other countries. And again, right now we are in a period where the U.S. is sort of, other countries like the U.S. are sort of second guessing or having to pull back. The more you try and make higher education available to the more people, the harder it is for government to fund it and to support it affordably. So I think the questioner is right that there are some that right now, and we're seeing Canada and Britain really compete with the U.S. on price especially for international students, but even for U.S. students. But that's at the margins, and that's not going to fundamentally change sort of how the U.S. funds its higher education.
And then here's a question. So colleges are losing money and are not expected to get a lot more from state governments. Would you expect to see some of them merge or close? And the answer is yes. Now, the primary type of college that will close is the kind of college I was talking about a little while ago, the small private that doesn't have much money. When they run out of money, they're done. And there are a lot of these colleges that have somewhat miraculously stuck around until now, many of them providing a very good education. Money doesn't equal a good education. And but they are truly unable to make payroll in many cases, unable to go on. They are very much on the merge or close list. But in the public sector, look at what's going on in Pennsylvania, where they are talking about merging some of the small colleges in the Pennsylvania state system. This is going to happen in other states. And all I can say is it's going to get very tense as colleges consider what the realities are. But if the choice is for colleges to continue to be severely underfunded, or perhaps to have some mergers and then be better funded, I'm not so sure what the answer should be. And obviously any closure or merger is very traumatic to those who are at the college and to others. But I think in the next few years, colleges are really going to have to think about what they most want. That's all the time we have today. I want to thank all of you for listening. I again want to thank Region Education for sponsoring this. Have a good day.